Welcome to the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Brian Russell, and today I have the privilege of interviewing Arianna Molloy. Arianna has a great new book. It's called Healthy Calling: From Toxic Burnout to Sustainable Work. She has some really powerful insights that are going to help you in your own life to understand calling and also how to avoid overworking, how to build sustainable systems. And you're going to learn a lot about some of the very things that I care about on this show, which is deeply formed leaders who can stay in ministry, in life, in their vocations for the long term. If you find these materials helpful, I would appreciate it if you would like, share, and subscribe to the podcast to help other people find it. There's going to be links to the resources that Arianna shares, including, again, highly recommend. It was one of the best books I've read on the topic of burnout and sustainable work. It's Healthy Calling: From Toxic Burnout to Sustainable Work. There is a link down below in the show notes. And if you go ahead and purchase that book or anything else that you're interested in getting on Amazon, there is a little bit that comes back to support the show, and I'm grateful for that. Also, if you go to my website, brianrussellphd.com, you can sign up for my newsletter, which will give you some updates and resource you in your spiritual formation, your missional imagination, and your commitment to leading in a way that embodies the values and ethics of God's kingdom. Now let's jump into my conversation with Arianna Molloy. Hi, Arianna. Thanks for coming on my podcast today.
I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited. Again, congratulations on your book with InterVarsity Press, Healthy Calling: From Toxic Burnout to Sustainable Work. Can you just introduce yourself a little bit by kind of briefly sharing your spiritual journey that's brought you up to the present time where you teach at Biola and or have, again, just written a great book called Healthy Calling?
Thank you. Well, the first thought that I had when you said introduce yourself is I'm a coffee person. I feel like that might be important to know. Um, I'm the kind of coffee person that after I've had a coffee, I think about when can I have another one. But yeah, so I had the great privilege of growing up in a home with two parents who loved me well and loved each other well.
Mhm.
And they did not come from homes that had that dynamic, but they were able to bring that into our home together. And so I grew up in a space where we got to talk about everything, including work. And so they talked about their work worlds when I was a kid at the dinner table, and they would talk to me about my job as a student like it was work. And so work has always been fascinating to me. I have also been in love with Jesus since I can remember. It's not that exciting of a story. I just have always felt his presence. And so I have intentionally followed him since I was 4. In fact, when I was 4 and I asked God to be in my heart as my savior, I wanted to wait to be 5 to get baptized so that I'd really remember it. I remember that my father, who at the time was on pastoral staff, he baptized me in the ocean in Santa Monica. They were on staff at the original vineyard, and I forgot to close my mouth. So I sucked in all this water. But yeah, I've loved the Lord my whole life long, and there's been highs
Wow.
and lows, but he's been my shepherd throughout the whole process. So I went to college not having any idea what I wanted to do. And I thought that was a really bad secret. I didn't know. I thought everyone else knew what they wanted to do. I changed my major 5 times. And I realized that I loved communication and that it was okay to love your major. So I chose communication, not because I knew what I was going to do with it, but because it was fascinating to me. And I loved the faculty and I loved the students and the concepts made sense to me. And I saw immediate application. I graduated having no clue what I was going to do with it. And I had a job at a church that I was working at and a nonprofit. At the end of the day, I was a little bit, I liked both for different reasons, but I was a little bit bored. And so I thought, if I can, I might as well get a master's in my degree. And I did. And when I got my master's degree, before I got my PhD, when I was in that first semester of grad school, I felt like a bird who'd been let out of a cage, that I could stretch my wings and ask these hard questions, and everybody wanted to be there. And so for me, the lights really turned on when I was in grad school. And so I did that, and I worked with a nonprofit for a year, and I was an adjunct. And again, I was a little bit bored, and I thought, oh, if I can get a full ride scholarship, PhD, let's do that. And I did, to my first choice. And It wasn't until the third year of my PhD program where I was walking on campus, getting ready to teach undergrads and to take my doctoral classes, and my heart suddenly filled with love for the students.
Mhm.
And I saw them and I immediately felt like, oh my gosh, I think I'm supposed to do this for my job.
Wow. No, I love that. That's so cool. And I guess 12 years in, you haven't lost your enthusiasm for it, then I
No,
take it.
I love it. And in fact, sometimes I'll walk around campus at Biola and hold my hands open and just say, Lord, do you still want me here? And I still feel that peace in my heart that is only from the Lord that says, yes, this is where you're to be for now. I'll try to always hold my sense of calling with an open hand.
Yeah, I'm curious. You have this great story of converting just well, almost just naturally being a Christian your entire life, and then you ended up being a professor to teach at a Christian institution. When you were little, did you dream about being a professor at all? I'm just curious.
No, and in fact, I remember coming home. So neither of my parents, they're incredibly amazing, smart, hardworking people. Neither of them graduated college. So they were very supportive of me, but they hadn't walked through the whole process. And so when I was, learning how to register for the next semester or think about different things, I didn't know what in the world I was doing. And I remember very clearly trying to figure out how to register for classes my first semester. And I was standing in the parking lot and it was raining and I was crying and I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. And I went home to my parents. I drove back home and I just said, "Can I be a professional daughter? Because I know how to do that. I know how to do that really well." I couldn't envision what work after college looked like. And I just felt really badly about that. Like something was wrong with me.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I was just curious because I know like I'm one of the few people I actually wanted to be a professor when I was like 6 years old,
You
and
did?
I'm like one of the only people I've ever met that actually, other than wanting to be a professional football player, some actually got to
Yeah,
grow up and do what I did. So anyway, that was just an
that's
aside.
really
I was
cool.
just
Well,
curious. Yeah.
yeah, I will say since the time I was little, I felt like I was meant to speak to large groups of people and to be pastoral in
Mm.
encouraging them about the truth of Jesus. That I remember like as a young kid, I would go to church and I would take notes, and I had on one side notes about how well that person was communicating, and on the other side
Wow.
what they were saying. And I just naturally was drawn to, oh, this made sense to me when they said it this way, or I should do this when I'm speaking. And so from the time I can remember, I think I was a communicator. I just don't think I had that name. So.
Okay, that makes sense. That's kind of what I was kind of getting at because I didn't dream about teaching at a seminary, but when I was a little boy, I loved war for some reason.
Mhm.
And I wanted to be a historian of World War II because I read military books all the time, and I always
Mm.
think back like, geez, I sort of got to do what I wanted to do. So it sounds okay.
Yeah.
That's what I was curious. Anyway, let's get right into your book. Though you wrote
Okay.
this great book. Again, healthy calling, and then the subtitle is just a killer one: from toxic burnout to sustainable work. And as I kind of said before, like when I read toxic burnout, I was like, oh, okay, I have to read this one because I've literally, and I didn't bring you on to do therapy with me either, but I've struggled. Like my father always had two or three jobs. He was a working class, hardworking guy. And I've always worked, and my dad worked, I mean, he's still alive, but I mean, he worked basically up until 2 or 3 years ago when he's just getting old at this point. And so I've just always had that model of work, work, work. And so it's always been natural. So I haven't burned myself out for a while now, but I felt it. And then when I read your book, I loved how you unpack that, you connected it to calling, all kinds of stuff. So just tell everybody listening, anything I said is resonating. Go ahead and get this book. This is one of the best
Mhm.
books I've read on this particular topic.
Thank you.
Let's play with some of the terms just because I think people use things different ways. And let's just start out. I mean, you you make it sound even worse: toxic burnout versus
Yeah,
just burnout. So let's just start there. Like, what's the difference between burnout and toxic burnout?
sure. Well, burnout's certainly gotten a lot of the headlines in the last several years. And so we are all, in some ways, maybe we're burnt out talking about burnout. I don't know. I could talk about it forever. But yeah, so burnout in general is not a good feeling. It has to do with there's a psychological paralysis, there's exhaustion, deep exhaustion, lethargy, numbness, a sense of you've lost a sense of meaning in what you're doing. Maybe the exhaustion is that you're scrolling, social media and then your pictures and then your calendar and anything that you can scroll before engaging with other people. It can really diminish your relationships. It can cause, greater sick days in the workplace. It is not fun. It's not good. So I just want to acknowledge that. It's really not good. When it comes to work, that sense of burnout has to do with, I don't like what I'm doing anymore. And that can really cause a pause in what someone has been previously enjoying doing. Now, burnout from a calling is different. And I think before we talk about the definition of toxic burnout, we have to talk about calling. So when I'm talking about calling, I'm not talking about our primary calling, which is to love God and love others. As Christians, as believers, we are all called, whatever we're doing, in whatever capacity, to do it as if we're doing it for the Lord. We have an opportunity to respond to our caller in worshipful ways. And we get to do that in all parts of our life. But God is not just a masterful creator. He is a personal artist, and he has designed each of us with skill sets and passions that when we get to do them, it feels joyful. It feels like worship. Maybe not all the time, but like 80% of the time, you're like, I'm so glad to be doing this. And so when you are feeling called, it's actually in response to relationship with the caller. So that's really important. We got to hang on to this, okay? Calling is about relationship. We get so distracted sometimes with like, what is my calling? I don't know what I'm called to do. And those are important questions, but actually the question should be, how am I getting to know my caller? Because calling involves actually relationship with three different groups of people. The caller, which we know as God, the called, which is us, and the community that we seek to impact. Because at the end of the day, calling is more than a hobby. It's something that we want to do to make the world a better place, to do something better that is purposeful and it has meaning and it positively impacts others. Okay, so that's calling. It's relationship. So let's go back to burnout versus toxic burnout. Toxic burnout is all of those things we just talked about earlier, that psychological paralysis, the exhaustion, the numbness, the increase in cynicism, all of those things, plus a deep shame. Because if you are no longer feeling called to the work that you used to feel like was a calling, it's not just, I don't like what I'm doing. It's, I don't know who I am anymore. And the shame from that is that there's a sense of letting the caller down, letting yourself down, and letting your community down. So that is a deeper type of burnout, and it's a toxicity that affects our identity to the core.
Mhm. Okay. Okay. Yeah, that was interesting. 'Cause I had one of my questions was what's the relationship with shame? So to be in toxic burnout, it has to be so bad that you actually feel shame versus if you're just sort of fried for whatever reason,
Right.
that just may be in your, so would you even distinguish then, like, I don't know if you've seen a lot of pastors I know read John Mark Comer, and he has the
Mhm.
book, like
Love
the
him.
Ruthless Elimination of Hurried. So when he's talking about that, he's talking about a different kind of burnout where you're just too busy. And so burnout is more than just being like a workaholic and too busy. It's going beyond that, and it's your whole identity is basically in crisis. Is that right?
Absolutely. But let me be clear, the
Yeah.
workaholism is one of the pathways to toxic burnout.
Okay.
So
All right.
when we are following the footsteps of workaholic addiction, where work is a compulsion, where we choose to lean into work because it's controllable and it feels good to do it, but most importantly, in the addiction process, it feels terrible when we're not doing it.
Yeah.
When we're doing that, that is a quick, like fast-paced track to toxic burnout. So that's
Okay, that's
one of the
good.
things that, and the good news is we have control over that to an extent. We can actually, do something about it. There are some parts of our job that we don't have control over. We don't have control over if, we have to have multiple jobs because we need to make the ends meet, or if we have a boss that's super not getting us, or using manipulation or marginalization, or even what we call spiritual commodification, spiritual labor in a way that is kind of manipulating our calling. We don't always have control over that. We can do certain things, but we have control over saying, oh my gosh, is what I'm doing right now not a high capacity thing? it's a workaholic thing. And so that's a clear sign to toxic burnout for sure.
Okay. Yeah, and you have some really interesting points. And again, thanks for going into the calling stuff because I didn't even put a question about that, but that was critical because that was one of the things I liked about your book. Because a lot of times, I mean, I guess I've fallen into it too. Is like you just think, okay, what's people want to know what's the call, and I did appreciate the fact that again you connect this with my identity. You didn't really say this, but like um, fundamentally a person loved by Jesus, period, and
Mm.
everything has to flow out of that. And I think that's just a really powerful reminder. You also use the phrase meaningful work, and then in your subtitle, you have the sustainable work, and that really resonated with me. So talk about the differences between those, and while maybe it's a trap to want meaningful work.
No, I certainly don't think it's a trap, actually. I think that we were hardwired to be purpose-making creatures because we were designed in the image of a purpose-making God. And so to thirst for meaning is innately human. It's part of human flourishing. If you were to look at philosophers who study the good life, that's essential. But when our search for meaningful work eclipses our dedication and thirst and development in relationship to God, that's when we actually can get into that other part of the dark side, which not it's not workaholism, it's actually job idolization. And so that thirst for meaningful work, not only is that human, it's actually a good thing. There are lots of social scientists that would say of all the things that help you stay motivated in the workplace, purpose is essential. You actually need a sense of purpose. A paycheck is fine. It's really good actually, but it doesn't actually promise long-term motivation. Once we take the idea that we're making enough money to pay the bills, which by the way is a big, big thing. But once we take that off the table, if we are making enough money to pay the bills, that sense of purpose really becomes a high priority. And so, meaningfulness is important, but it's not enough. Meaningfulness is one of the four ways we experience work as a calling. The other three parts of work as a calling are that sense of meaningfulness is one. There's a clear identifiable caller. And you know what's really fascinating, Brian, is that people who don't believe in God totally identify with this too. You know, I was driving down the 55 freeway in California, and there's a billboard for a hospital, and it says, "Your healing is our calling." I was watching a show and there was a commercial that popped up and it was for a Dodge Ram truck and it said, "Our calling is to make good trucks." You know, in my interviews with people, I've interviewed artists who believed that their guitar was their caller. I really believe that that thirst to connect to a caller is hardwired in us because we were created by God. We were created to thirst for him. So that's the second thing. The third thing is that skill set and passion. So it's not enough to really enjoy your work. You need to be good at it. And it's not enough to be good at it long term. If you're only good at it and you don't enjoy it, and this is something I see a lot of newly graduated students do, is they get into a job and it's like, "Oh, I'm good at this. It feels good." That's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But you also need to find a connection there. And so that's important too. Passion alone is not enough. As one CEO I interviewed said, passion alone makes you a great fan. Skill set and passion make you a great employee. But this is where even like John Mark Comer's concept of apprenticeship and apprenticeship in Jesus and apprenticeship in general is really important to grow and develop. That fourth part, meaningfulness, a caller, skill set and passion, that fourth part is really where we see the impact of society. Work calling is what social psychologists and organizational communication scholars call pro-social behavior. So we see this need, this impact to make a difference, and we know we can. And that is, of course, why of all the people groups in the workplace, people who approach work as a job or a career or a calling, of all the people groups, if you feel called to work, there's so much good to it, but you're also the most prone, you're the most likely to experience burnout.
Yeah, that's what seems kind of ironic, and I like I guess let's talk about the idle part again. I had to skip parts just because it had so much. I could have asked a million questions. But like I thought that was interesting. You know, obviously I teach Old Testament. Well, I'm not obviously don't know me yet, but I mean that's my focus. Like I work on Exodus and Psalms, and one of my big pieces, the last book I wrote, I made up a word. I called it um, idolatherapy, that the key to our
Mm.
sanctification was basically to allow God to do deep work in our lives to get all that idolatry out of us, which to me, the one of the things the Old Testament gives the church is it's a bulwark against paganism, essentially. It's and the gods and goddesses have disappeared, but what they represent really hasn't. And And I thought that it was really interesting that part of the whole kind of descent to burnout. And this is where I think it really helps pastors. And I mean, really, it spoke to me too, is like, at some level you can justify doing anything because almost everything a pastor or even even a professor that works in a religious institution, you could argue it's good and it's even kingdom oriented and it's profoundly meaningful, but at some point you've gone past capacity, which that's where I was thinking that maybe meaningful itself was a negative, because if that's your
Mm.
only filter, it's a negative, I guess, right? So connect that a little bit with this whole idea of idolatry, idolization of our calling, I guess.
Yeah. So similar but distinct from workaholism, rather than it being a compulsion, job idolization is when we give our work the greatest priority.
Mm,
So it is the way that we align the rest of our life. It is the reason that we continually use to not show up for the people in our lives. And it's how we measure everything else in our life. So it is absolutely the contemporary version of idolatry. And when we allow our work to not just be an expression of who we are, but our work then becomes the definition of who we are, we run into significant problems. And the reality is that people change jobs on average between the ages of 18 and 42. They could change job on average 10 times. So if we are so tightly held, if our fists are so tightly around our job title, and the likelihood of us changing jobs is pretty high. I mean, it's less likely, I think, in academia. Actually, it's one of the areas of work where people sort of stay. But even so, we can run into an identity crisis. Nevertheless, I think scripture is very clear that we are to care for the people in our household, that we are given as gifts and responsibilities to, and if we are not caring for them well, then everything else suffers. So when work takes a greater priority over our family and our close personal relationships, we need to pay attention.
good. So just define, just so it's clear for everybody, and you sort of said this a little bit earlier, but at what point do you shift from idolization to addiction, or maybe you don't necessarily shift, but what's the real distinction between somebody that idolizes their job to the detriment of other people in their lives, and then flat out a person who's a workaholic?
Yeah, they look similar. But one is it's not so much that in the addictive component to work that it's the most important. It's just that you can't help yourself. You see that red dot show up, another message, and you just can't help yourself. Or you think, well, I've already done enough work today, but I need to do more. Because if you slow down long enough, then other emotions, other relational dynamics will rise to the surface like water after it's stilled from being rocked back and forth. And then you have to face these things. But work, unfortunately, feels more controllable. And so, when, especially this is the case, especially in midlife, people, when their lives feel all over the place, but their work life, they can go back to that. They can control that. And so people will go to that as a type of amelioration, as a type of sedation of all the problems that are happening. That's addiction. But an idol is when we are so puffed up with the pride of that title. We have convinced ourselves that the calling is the caller. And in fact, perhaps we feel that we are almost the caller, that everything else, including the community, including ourselves, and including the caller, takes second stage. And so we give excuses. Oh no, I'm called to this. This is ministry. I got to do this. I need to answer this one email. I need to do this other thing. And the reality, I want to be very clear. Like I'm talking like it's so easy. It's not easy. I was working with a hospital staff a little while ago, a few months ago, and they said very clearly to me, "Hey, when we try to take a break, people die."
Mm, yeah.
So when I'm talking about learning how to take a rest and how to take a break, I don't mean to be cavalier about that. When I'm talking, I mean, both my husband and I work. We have a young kid. We have parents who need our help and support. And so we're that panini generation. So we feel it. We feel it. And I don't want to take that lightly. But at the end of the day, when the work becomes more important than the people in our lives, we have lost sight of the correct orientation.
It's good. It's good. I thought one of the most interesting illustrations of that was, and I don't know what chapter in the book it was now, but when you're talking about like when a person who's, and I don't remember if this was idolization or workaholism now, but when you literally try to stop and slow down, that day ends up feeling terrible. And I don't,
Yes.
yeah, and I've
I mean,
experienced that. Like I've
sure.
gone on vacation, and the first 4 days of vacation are horrible. Then I have fun for one day, and then I'm back, and I never even got a break or whatever. And or Sundays when I finally started taking a whole day off, I just remember that was like, oh, it was the worst day of the week every week because I made myself do nothing and it was just hard. I've gotten through that just with by sticking with it. But is connect that. I thought that was I haven't seen too many people actually describe that. And I thought,
Oh,
wow,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So we have a very poor understanding of rest. And even that idea that rest equals doing nothing is not necessarily how it was intended to be. I love actually how John Mark Comer talks about Sabbath as taking a break from the worries, the wants, and the work. You can think of it like tithing your time to the author of time. But in rest, we are still the people God created us to be. And so there's a really great, it's a TED talk and a TED article about the 7 types of rest by a medical doctor, Dalton Smith. And so part of it is learning, how do you rest? Maybe, maybe you're doing it wrong. I know I often do it wrong. And so, really taking a diagnostic of what actually reorients and refreshes you. Now, again, Sabbathing and tithing our time isn't really for us at all. It's actually a sign of obedience of saying, Father, I'm going to stop everything that distracts me the other 6 days of the week so that I can turn to you. And every time I have a worry or like I tend to strategize and I have a spreadsheet in my brain that like I'm color coding all the schedules. And on that day, I don't do that. On that day, I don't open up my social media apps. I don't answer my emails. I'm very limited in the texts that I answer. We have an unplug box in our home and then we put our phones in it. And all of that is to show me how easily I am succumbing to the urgency of the world, but not the urgency of the spirit. So I would say, read Gary Thomas's Sacred Pathways, figure out what are the ways in which you feel close to God. There's 9 different ways in which you can feel close to God that Gary Thomas talks about in his book. And then also look at the 7 types of rest and with your family, figure out how you can support each other in the ways that you rest. So for example, my husband is an Enneagram 3 textbook. Like he's an achiever. He loves to get things done, right? So for him, it would almost be a punishment to make him sit still. For him, he feels rested when he is playing or serving others. Like it blesses him. And for me, I'm a contemplative and I love to be in nature. So I feel rested when I actually do physically slow down and I'm in nature and I look around. So we support each other in that. Is there benefit to me learning how to play? Absolutely. Is there benefit to my husband learning how to physically be still? Absolutely. But also, God has made us to feel enlivened with certain things, and we shouldn't ignore that on our day of rest. Rest is not necessarily the same thing as solitude, although they often go hand in hand.
No, that's good. I think I really appreciate that. And I think it's so important for people to kind of own what's their soul actually need and to be filled. So I really like that. Well, you just mentioned the word contemplative, and I appreciated in your book in several places you had exercises. First, you had a great first one I ran into was the breath prayer, but then you talk about examine, you talk about gratitude, and so talk a little bit about maybe how and this is new in Protestantism, it's kind of been a turn back towards solitude and silence practices. I'm a big centering prayer person, and I've been doing centering prayer and examine basically for 14 years now, and that's kind of served my soul. And I always joke, I actually get invited to talk about centering prayer more than I get to talk about the Bible at this point in my life, which is funny for my degree. But that's literally, basically revolutionized my inner world. So I like that part of the book. So like
Sure.
how do these practices help us slow down, practice Sabbath, avoid or heal from burnout? Like how would you answer that?
I'm thinking of all the times in scripture where we're told to remember, 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 right? We so easily forget. As a communication professor, one of the things that we talk a lot about is not just our interpersonal communication, our communication with others, but our intrapersonal communication, our communication with ourselves. And part of remembering is a whole person activity. So I think rituals and routines that help us turn towards a mindful way of listening to the Lord are really useful. When those become like strict rules, that can be problematic. But when it's a heart, when it's an attitude of the heart, I think having those rituals is really good. So I started a practice maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I actually go for a walk the day before my family and I Sabbath,
Mm.
really early in the morning. And we do live a little close to the water, so I get to walk by the beach, which is amazing for my soul. And I walk for 30 minutes and I don't listen to anything. And I start off my walk, I stand in a particular place, I hold my hands open and I say, "Okay, Lord, I'm here. I want to walk with you." And I think about the successes of the week and the places where I felt like I failed, and I ready my heart. I call it like a pre-game Sabbath strategy, and it makes me think about the week in a different way so that when I have that final push of work on that Friday, because we Sabbath on Saturdays, I'm like totally ready to go with a different mindset. We also are in our pajamas longer on Saturday mornings. We have pancakes and we take our time to pray the prayer of examine. And so I think developing routines when I was single and I was trying to Sabbath, that was a different experience too, because part of it was just not wanting to be lonely. When you're married and you have young kids, sometimes Sabbathing is like, I just want 5 minutes by myself.
Right.
But when you're single, and you're trying to Sabbath, I think one of the greatest detriments is actually not feeling even more lonely. And scholars talk about that sense of Sabbath sadness that can happen when you're working so hard those 6 days out of the week and you slow down and all of a sudden all these emotions of sadness rise. And here's the reality: emotions are tunnels. We have to go through them. Can't go around them, can't go under them, can't go over them, have to go through them. So we have to figure out what to say to ourselves. Hey, it's okay to be sad. Sadness does not mean you failed. Sadness does not mean you're going to live in that. I'm not talking about chronic sadness or long-term sadness, but having days where we feel a little bit sad, there's something on the other side of that sadness. And if we can have the courage to lean into that just a little bit, we might discover something on the other side. So I think that's really, really important. So when I was single, a lot of times what I would do is I would cook because it was fun for me. And I would cook a big meal and just like really savor that process. And that felt very active, but also restful.
That's good. Yeah, I guess now to talk about the whole thing with emotions a little bit. I thought that was I think that's interesting because you don't really because one of the things that you don't realize, or at least maybe I didn't, was working so much. I realized I didn't know how to feel stuff, and it's taken a lot of years, basically, and a lot of the sitting in silence and everything, just to let everything kind of stir up. And then it's kind of surprising. And so it's like, how do you help somebody? Like when I coach somebody on centering prayer, the thing that most people don't know it's going to happen. Everybody talks about, ooh, if you just meditate, everything's going to be great. It actually makes everything worse if you do
Yes.
it because it brings everything just kind of starts, and the ancients knew this. If you study the monks and stuff, and they have the whole seven deadly sins came. But so how do you like prepare a person who's maybe worked too much to actually be ready for this avalanche of feelings? You mentioned loneliness, but there can be other really, it could
Yeah.
be anger, it could be just
Yep.
all kinds of different things. Traumas can come up when you sit in silence. There's just a lot of sometimes pain that people carry that they don't even know that they've bottled up and that their
Yeah.
work for the Lord has allowed them, like, unfortunately, to cover it up.
Yeah, such an important question, a really, really good question. Several things. One is Sabbath is not the junk drawer of rest. So let me just say that if we're working super intensely the other 6 days of the week, Sabbath is not going to like cure something for us. Again, Sabbath is relationship with God, and it's a tithing of our time to the author of time. So if we're also working really hard, we also might need like a day off, which is different than a Sabbath day.
Yeah,
So let me just say that.
it's good.
Um, I don't know why. I have all these random ideas and to-do list things that pop into my head on Sabbath more than any other day. And so I have to write them down. So because I'm worried if I forget them, it's going to cause more stress. And so I do have a notepad that I just write everything down on that day so that I know I can return to it the next day. I won't forget it. It's there. but I'm not going to think about it. I'm going to write it down, and then I'm literally going to offer it up to the Lord in prayer. Oh, Father, I'm so stressed about this. I'm going to write this down, and I need your help with this. I'm going to talk about it with you tomorrow. Today, I trust you. I trust you. So I would say that. I think that it's really, really important to allow those feelings to surface, but also this is where having spiritual direction and therapy is so essential. I mean, we really are, that third C of community. It's not just the people we serve; it's the people who impact us. And to have a healthy calling, we need healthy community. We're not meant to be isolated in this process. And so we need places to talk about it. The other thing I would say is so Sabbath is not a junk drawer for rest. We also need to take time in our day, each day, to have a Sabbath mindset. So Dan Pink wrote this great book called When, and it's about time, all these different cool things about time, like when you're most productive, everything. It's super fascinating. But he talks about how if you have two 15-minute breaks a day, it's like having a nap they're micro breaks, you know. You could even do like a 5-minute break if you need to, but 15-minute breaks, and they have to be away from social media and your app. So taking a break away from your phone, you can listen to something, but your eyes are not on your screen. Those two 15-minute breaks can totally reorient you, like waking up from a nap. So, one of my goals this year is that if I'm in between classes, so there's one day this semester where I have two back-to-back 3-hour classes and I only have a 10-minute break, and it's not my favorite thing in the world.
Yeah.
But if it's 10 minutes or less, I will not go on my phone. That might seem really small, but it's a big deal because I have a million emails and so many texts. So in my mind, I want to make use of that 10-minute time. But instead, I look out the window. I walk around campus. I sit and I look out. And it's 10 minutes. And it's really, really hard. But I find that I'm always more refreshed and a little more at peace if I do that versus trying to maximize my time all the time. So I would look for micro breaks
It's good.
each day. I would say challenge yourself to at least one micro break a day where you're not going to technology. You can listen to music, you can listen to a podcast, but like your eyes are lifted away from the screen for 15 minutes and see how that feels.
That's really good. Yeah, thank you. That's um you just mentioned community, that we need community. And I thought you had a really interesting I don't again I don't remember what chap this was, but you actually had it was in italics, work is not your family. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's it. And then you think, okay, well, I do religious work, so like maybe I'm a pastor and I'm shepherding the family of God. And again, that's a trap that we can fall into. But just talk about that. I think because that was a really freeing statement that work is not your family.
Yeah, it's really hard. Let me just say this. There is an asterisk to that because I have seen a few organizations
Yeah,
that have done that family metaphor pretty well. But they've done that with the healthy family mindset. Not like you have to obey mom and dad. I'm disciplining you, but oh, there's a crisis. How can I care for you? How can we come around you and be there for you? And so generally, it's a metaphor I wouldn't advise. I think it's extra complicated in Christian contexts because we are brothers and sisters in Christ. And when we go to church as attenders, we are a family. But on the inside, in the work part of it, we can be a team, we can be a community, we can be a village, whatever metaphor you want. You don't fire family.
yeah, that's right.
And at the end of the day, the damage that the family metaphor can have on a person who is told, we'll take care of you, you're part of the family, but guess what? Job cuts are happening. We've prayed, or someone will say, we've prayed about it. We have to
Yeah.
let you go. That's really complicated. And I don't know that that's the right way to do that. So I would suggest staying away from that metaphor as much as possible, unless you can really live up to it. One organization in particular that I'm thinking that does this well has very little turnover. Most people have worked there for 30 or 40 years. And so they are taken care of like family. And I think that's a fairly accurate description, but it's very hard to do that.
Okay, thank you. I thought that was just really helpful. And then And again, I don't know why this surprised me, but it did. Maybe it says more about me. But you did it. You focused on humility a lot in a book on burnout, and I found that fascinating. I believe two whole chapters, and it came through in a couple of other places. So connect humility to this conversation about calling, burnout, and sustainable work.
Yeah. So the third year of my job at Biola, I was single, but I was planning a wedding, so I was engaged. I was working an overload. I was on several committees, and I remember waking up in the middle of the night, and my heart was beating like I had just run a race, but I hadn't been. And I realized that I was like really close to burnout. And I did the little like checklist in my head of like, oh, I'm feeling this. Yep. Oh my gosh. Oh no. So I went to my dean and I said, I think I'm really close to burnout. And so he was kind enough to say, okay, let's get you off of some of these committees that you don't need to be on. How can we conclude some other things? And then a colleague of mine said, hey, there's this fellowship that you can apply for. And if you do, your teaching load gets cut in half for that semester. I honestly, Brian, did not even pay attention to what the fellowship was about. I just thought, ooh, I need a break. I'm going to do this. And so turns out the fellowship was about studying the virtue of humility. So these other professors across the country, we came as a small group of us that had got the fellowship, and we studied for a whole semester the virtues of humility from all different social sciences and theology. And what was wild to me is that as I'm studying humility and I'm looking at the data of people who experienced a healthy calling, they overlapped. And the reality is, if we look at scripture, we see that we are literally told we have to walk humbly with our God, to be like Jesus, who was humble. And yet we have this really ridiculous understanding of humility. We think of it as passive. We think of it as having no boundaries. We think of it as being synonymous with modesty. It's not. They're not the same. They can look the same. They can go together. It's not the same. And at the end of the day, what we found, or what I found in my research, is that to live out the virtues of humility practically is literally the compass to a healthy calling. That if we pursue those virtues, and there's three of them in particular, that it really helps protect us from getting overcome by that toxic burnout.
Yeah, could you just say a little bit more then? Like, how would a person again, I don't want to give your whole book away, but like, but like, how would a person know if they were humble enough? Which is kind of always the funny question.
I know,
It's
right?
like,
Don't think of an elephant, and then you think of an elephant. Yeah, I think part of it is breaking it down. So you could study it biblically.
yeah, yeah,
Jesus was humble and he knew who he was. So let's look at that. Part of humility, and you look at organizational books, Jim Collins' Good to Great, Patrick Lencioni's, The Team Player, all these phenomenal books. And what do they say? They say a great leader is confident, but also humble. Well, how does that work? And the reality is, when you're in the workplace in particular, you don't want someone who's not clear on what they're good at.
yeah.
That's someone who's incompetent. You want someone who has a very solid sense of, I know what my strengths are. I know what my weaknesses are. I'm not distracted by either one. So that's the first part of humility. So in using humility as a diagnostic, you could ask yourself, have I been overly distracted with what I feel like I'm really good at and like defensive about other people giving me feedback? Or for me, I often get distracted on what I'm not good at. Oh, I feel really bad about this and it's distracting me, and that's literally all I'm seeing. That is also just pride. It looks differently, but it's pride. It's a focus on the self. So that's a diagnostic to look at. The second part of humility is that there's a desire for lifelong learning. One of Jesus's primary names was teacher, rabbi, and he taught us so that we might learn. He disciples us so we might disciple. Learning and wisdom and the fear of God and knowledge, those are all seen as good things. And so humility is the awareness you don't know everything. And it's a mentality that there's more to know. So diagnostic, in meetings, am I super defensive when someone challenges my ideas? Am I unwilling to delegate because I don't think other people are going to do it the way I'm going to do it, and the way I'm going to do it has to be that way, right? So diagnostic. And some of that will, of course, lead to burnout because it's control, control, control. The third part of humility is knowing how to step away, knowing that You are not the God of the universe, being very clear on who God is and who you are. And this is where Sabbath comes in, the ability to take a routine time away and say, ah, okay, this is not going to become an addiction. This is not going to become an idol. This is work. This is a healthy expression of myself, but it is not the definition of myself. And I will hold it with an open hand. And you can see that even in the Garden of Gethsemane, as Jesus talked about, like, okay, God, I think this is the plan, but if you want it another way, like, take this cup from me, you know? Jesus was in constant conversation with his heavenly Father about the will of God. And so a diagnostic would be like, ooh, am I feeling like I have to be involved in everything all the time? Am I worried that if I step away, people will forget about me or that it's all going to fall apart? That's a diagnostic that we can say, I need to lean into that healthy humility.
That's really good. Yeah. So let me ask one kind of last big question, then we'll try to wrap up some of the shorter ones. But I'm guessing everything that we've talked about is going to really resonate. I mean, your book is fantastic, and I highly
Thank you.
recommend folks pick up a copy of Healthy Calling. But so if a person's been listening, and whether they're into job idolization or they're actually teetering towards legit, just all in burnout, and again, a lot of pastors listen to this podcast and some and seminary students, and so where does a person begin to unwind and how do they begin to move forward if they realize that maybe they're teetering towards one of these unhealthy expressions of our calling?
Yeah. First, I just want to say if you're on that, if you're on that line where you think you might be falling onto the burnout side, like, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry you're feeling that way. You're not alone and you're not imagining it. I would also say that burnout doesn't go away on its own. So if you're starting to feel it, don't wait. Don't wait for something to magically change. You have to proactively say, I have to make some changes. And depending on how long you've been in this state, it may take a while. I was talking to someone who said they were feeling burnt out for 7 years,
Wow.
and that's not abnormal. So it's going to take more than a day or an 8-day vacation to have a sense of correction, course correction. But I think the first place to start is, who is your community? I would encourage you to develop a board of directors. If you don't have one already, build your own board. Think of 3 to 5 people who you can go to, who you admire and you think are wise. And it could be people you don't even know. Like maybe it's people listening to your podcast and Brian, you're part of their board. Or for me, C.S. Lewis is totally on my board of directors. I don't know him personally, but I read his literature and I feel held to accountability and enlivened by his wisdom. So I would say build a board of directors and routinely go to them with questions so that you can hold with an open hand the things you're struggling with, because as Brene Brown talks about, shame remains the strongest when we don't speak about it. We have to talk about it. And as we do, it loses that momentum and that intensity.
Well, yeah, thank you. It's so good. And I think I can keep asking you questions, but I think I'm going to move to
I
my
love
wrap
it.
up questions here. So, yeah, so talk a little bit about like for yourself. I mean, you have that great story at the beginning of the book where you're sitting in your car and I think a friend catches you, and I can't
Yeah.
remember, but you're like burned out and you don't want to get out of the car to go to work. And I think anybody that's I think everybody can relate to that in some way. Like you just like, oh, I just wish today, or I've always felt bad. A couple times when I was taking too many speaking engagements, I'd be sitting there and I'm like, please don't call my name. I really don't want to talk now. Will somebody, and then I feel horrible because these people are looking forward to hearing me talk, but I'm just too tired. And, I get up and do it or whatever. So we've all been there and had those moments where it's like, and like in your case, I just can't get out of the car to do my job. So, what do you do now? Maybe like what's your routines look like that keep you grounded and and reasonably on the right side of falling into maybe unhealthy patterns? What practices really keep you connected to
Yeah.
and able to sustain in your kingdom work?
I think that I've learned to not romanticize the ability to push through.
That's good.
So I think that for a long time, I thought it was pretty awesome. It was almost a superpower that I had the ability to push through. It's not awesome. That's survival mode. Survival mode is simply meant to get us to the next place. It is not a place we're meant to live in. And so I have learned to pay attention to that and not think it's romantic. Not think, oh, I've got this. Isn't it great that I somehow managed to make it through? But actually, no, no. This is not healthy for me. My body is talking to me. I agreed to have a speaking engagement a couple months ago, and I had agreed to one too many by accident. I wasn't paying attention to my calendar. I said yes without realizing it. Couldn't get out of it. I go that night. They're running behind. I'm supposed to give my talk, and I thought I'd be home in time to say goodnight to my kid, and I'm now going to miss his bedtime. And so I'm super annoyed internally. So I realized I had to check my heart, and I actually excused myself and went into the hallway, and I just prayed and I said, Lord, I don't want to be here right now. I'm tired. But if there's one person here who needs to hear this, let me speak to them. This is your time. And I went up there, had massive tech issues. I was just like, the whole thing was a mess. But at the end of the time, there was a line out the door of people who wanted to talk. And they all said literally something like, I felt like that was just for me. And so I think at the end of the day, walking in humility and realizing this isn't actually about me. I now know to check my 2 week calendar rather than just my 1 week calendar when saying yes to things. But at the end of the day, I mean, maybe I'm rambling here, but just to say,
That's
like,
good.
we have to be diligent and active in the amount of commitments we make, and we have to know that we have to slow down in between.
That's
And
yeah,
I make
good.
mistakes all the time. I still overcommit. I overcommit a lot less. My radar is up a little bit more. And I know to honor that and pay attention to that. And then, really, I would say the last thing I would say is remembering to make sure I'm loving God and loving others well. When I'm not attending to my primary calling, everything else is going to fall apart.
Yeah, I really like that. I think it's really important to just to frame it out with loving God and loving neighbor. And I appreciate that. Um, Again, this is probably the hardest question I ask everybody is like if just to go down to like two or three books outside of the Bible that have really shaped you deeply. Like what did you come up with a couple of books that
Yeah. I mean, anything C.S. Lewis has
oh
written.
yeah,
I
you
think
said
my
that.
two favorites of his are The Great Divorce. I probably read that every 3 or 4 years. And then The Horse and His Boy in the Narnia series. I just love that so much. Anything by Dallas Willard, of course, is amazing. Brendan Manning, The Furious Longing of God, is this little book that has a ship in the middle of a storm, and it's just beautiful. Um, I think there are so many books that have informed who I am. It's hard to really take stock of which ones, but ultimately C.S. Lewis. And then I'll just say Jane Austen is absolutely one of my favorite authors. And I think her social commentary on women and work and society is brilliant. And I love going back to her literature just to look at the way people are talked about. I think the ability to notice people and pay attention to the layers of messages is really essential. Our emotional intelligence, especially when it comes to nonverbal communication, and she describes that really beautifully in her books, I think that needs some help these days.
Well, that's well said, and yeah, and thanks for throwing in a little bit of fiction there too. I do get sometimes that, but I think no, I think that's good fiction. I don't read enough of it myself, but several fiction books. Like I love Hemingway, and I've always liked
Oh,
Steinbecks and stuff, and I always feel like and they're just as deep, and sometimes they're deeper in some ways than nonfiction books. So thanks for throwing those in. Do you have another project going on? And like sometimes I like to frame it. Again, you're still pretty young, but it's like, is there some like book
oh,
inside
thanks.
of you that you hope to that you're kind of almost afraid to tackle? I think that's I'm just curious, or like, or just what you're working on now, whatever you feel comfortable talking about.
I love that you asked that. And yeah, I have several half-formed thoughts. Um, I know there's been a lot of books about Sabbath. I still think we don't fully talk enough about the relational aspect as from a communication perspective, what that looks like. So I also think that Sabbathing in the different seasons of our life, again, as students, as singles, as married without kids, as married with kids, as married with kids gone, as widowers, like whatever that may be. I just, there's a lot of talk about it in certain times of life, but not all times of life. I think that would be fascinating. I don't know exactly what kind of writing project I would do with this, but I am really fascinated by the way that we as a society are talking about people who have retired or who are in the boomer generation. I'm not sure what happened, but somehow we've made it so that you don't have to thirst for purpose after you get a certain age, which is entirely a lie. We were designed by a purposeful God, and we thirst for purpose from the moment we're born until the moment we die. And we need to do a better job caring for people who are in that post-primary workplace. I think we need to have a better exit strategy in workplaces, but also in the church and society, and not relegate them to the side, because they have wisdom to offer and their need for purpose is just as strong as anybody else's. So I'd love to study how people who are thriving in that season of life, how they make sense of their calling.
No, that's good. Now that's going to be really important as people just keep living longer and longer too. So that's good work. And just the last question: where's the best place for folks to connect with you if they'd like to get to find some more of your materials? Like, so can you share about what the best place to find you online, and then also where's the best place to pick up a copy of Healthy Calling?
Yes, thank you so much. So ariannamolloy.com, you can go to my website. There's a lot of resources there. Another thing that I do is consulting with organizations and churches just on healthy communication in the workplace. That's, small group communication, nonverbal conflict, all of those things. And so there's some resources there. You can also send me a message. I'd be delighted to respond. Any bookstore. So Barnes and Noble, Amazon, local bookstore, and I'd be so honored. And if you like it, please send a review. That would be so helpful. And we need to keep talking about this. Relationship with God matters, and there's so many things that vie for our attention. It's really easy to forget what the centerpiece is.
Yeah, let me just ask you one question about your consulting. You just mentioned that, and I looked at your website. It also looks like you do some limited one-on-one coaching if somebody wanted to reach out for some one-on-one work too. Is that true?
Absolutely. So it is my pleasure. And the thing about communication is it's not a one size fits all. So one of my joys is to find out what someone's needs are, their strengths, and the areas they want to grow. And then we find ways to make that more them rather than someone else. So
Right.
absolutely.
Well, I want to say it's been a real absolute privilege speaking with you today, Arianna, and I appreciate your vibrant witness for Jesus that's come through on the interview, and just the helpful ways that you've responded to my questions. So thank you for coming on the show today.
You asked amazing questions. It was totally an honor. Thank you.
Good. And also, we want to thank you, all of you who've made it all the way to the end of this week's episode. And until next time, live by faith, be known by love, and be a voice of hope to others.